Today on this show, it's all about breaking up with the old system, starting new stuff, ending stuff, beginning again. And sometimes it's about doing things you used to do, and then maybe you didn't do them for a long time, and then all of a sudden you do them again. It turns out, with all that's going on in the world today, maybe the most interesting man in the world, Elon Musk, found a way to make himself relevant, found a way to stand out in the news. And if our context is things that used to happen and things that happen again, Elon Musk challenged Putin to a duel today, and the prize would be Ukraine. So this reminds me a little bit of dueling in the old days. And in some ways, a lot of people think that the last sort of medieval act, the last act of the old world that ended in the 1500s with Martin Luther and the Reformation and the rise of nation states over the medieval economic model, thinks that Alexander Hamilton, one of the originators of the American system, was sort of, captured up in the last feudal battle there was, where chivalry and honor and all these things were, still held in high esteem. So it took a few hundred years to work out the whole thing from the system. And now here it is again, in an era where nation states perhaps aren't as affected from a hard power militaristic point of view. We're looking right now at a whole convoy of tanks that seem useless. Remember, on this show, we predicted that back in January, that the war was probably, from a kinetic point of view, not as interesting as the economic side, because the kinetic side, we predicted drones, for example, would melt an aircraft carrier. I still predict that'll happen one day. But what we are seeing is drones effectively wipe out an entire tank unit and make them basically obsolete in war. They don't seem to stand any chance. I've seen these Javelin weapons and the other ones explained, and it's like a video game. You get a controller. It's a two-piece set. You get a controller that gives you heat signatures all along the field of where people are. The other device launches the missile into the air, and the drone literally pilots it down to its target. And I guess it's specifically designed to destroy tanks because it lands on the top and then detonates again after the shielding around the tank has been taken off. So maybe dueling's back. Maybe it's the only way. Maybe with the drones and the tanks, maybe dueling is the way to settle things. And maybe the medieval people were more civilized when it came to war. It wasn't all about Gatling guns and all that stuff. But this does provide a perhaps template to show where things are headed, where things are changing, and what new incentive models might rise up. And we're going to talk about that today, because more and more it looks like China is being mentioned in the larger context of this Russian conflict, and it sort of happened all weekend. First up, the biggest news around China, even not related to the conflict, but well, let me get to that next. Let's actually just take the first story to introduce China, and then I'll come back to what I think is the biggest news in China. So this had everyone talking all weekend, written by a guy named Hu Wei. And he's the chair of the Shanghai Public Policy Research Association, really big name in Chinese policy circles. And a fellow named Ramez Nam pointed out an article he had written last week called Possible Outcomes of the Russo-Ukrainian War and China's Choice. And so Ramez Nam translated or broke it down when the English translation came out and gave the TLDR on Twitter, and I'll read it back to you because it was really helpful. I do recommend reading the article yourself. And it says, basically breaks it down to this, that the Ukrainian invasion, the Russian invasion into Ukraine, one, possibly an escalation beyond Ukraine. We all agree with that. Two, certainly Putin's defeat. Three, the US regaining leadership in the Western world and the West being more united. Four, a new Iron Curtain falling globally, this time dividing democracies from authoritarian regimes and extending into Asia. Five, growth in the power of the West in both military strength and the strength and importance of Western institutions, greater soft and hard power. Six, further isolation of China as the US, EU, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Australia turn against China. And then his quote, China will not only be encircled militarily, but also challenged by Western values and systems. His conclusion is that China has about 1 to 2 weeks. He says 1 to 2 weeks to make a choice. And he obviously suggests that China should help the United States end things in Russia and use its influence over Putin in order to change things? Well, first of all, a lot of people caught on to this. I would say it's so easy to believe because you want to believe it. So you really got to check yourself to see what's in this analysis. It's so believable to me anyway, but does it really check out? Maybe not the US stuff, but the problems that China faces where it is in this war right now. And if you put it into the context of the actual news from this weekend, this adds to it. This was the part that I flipped the order of I was going to go with first. I think really important in the context of what was said in that letter. And this is written really about the supply chains, and that we're currently living in that brief moment between when economists know that there's big trouble coming again in the supply chain, but not everyone is talking about it yet. And I'm talking in particular to Shenzhen, one of the largest ports in the world, shutting down for a week because of COVID. And it looks like this policy and the COVID zero tolerance lockdowns in China are going to affect. So the policies of the central planning in China are about to affect supply chains globally again. And if you haven't noticed, supply chains have already come under pressure from global COVID policies. They've come under pressure from what we see with the war in Ukraine. So several policymakers now are stressing out our global supply chains again and again and again. And it seems like a recurring pattern. It's been going on for about 2 years where entirely new problems are introduced into global supply chains. First, it was the initial lockdowns. Then it was the increase in surge in demand when lockdowns were ending and people were getting back to doing stuff. And this created a whole different issue. Then we saw energy having a big role because, of course, everyone has to pay for shipping from China and all these different places with, they got to transport it. They need oil. So the price of oil is playing into that. And then inflation itself makes supply chains under stress because there's a lot of credit extended in trade finance, right? If you're sending something over 90 days, you can take payment at one point, maybe not cash it because it usually stays in some form of escrow for a little while, or even the person who shipped the goods has to wait for delivery to receive the money. And 90 days in this environment is a couple of percentage points. So not everyone's so keen on that. So some people don't ship, and supply chains basically, because of numerous policies, are under intense trouble. And if you combine that with what we're seeing in the United States, so that's the supply chain issues in China, you've got Europe and its energy trouble, and then you've got a brewing fight in America between the Federal Reserve and the oil and gas lobby. And it turns out the oil and gas lobby is using its influence, in particular in the Senate Banking Committee, to hold up confirmations for the Federal Reserve. In particular, one position, which would be for a position invented in the Dodd-Frank era to look into further policy and supervision of financial institutions, in particular banks, and how much leverage they take, and all kinds of other things. And it turns out that the US Senate Banking Committee is really worried that the Federal Reserve is going to name a person who is going to influence all forms of energy policy and pick winners and losers and basically choose the ESG matrix that we're seeing used in Europe. And one of the reasons for which they're under the Russian thumb, because they didn't invest in nuclear and need to basically import all of that energy from Russia. And it turns out today there's been a lot of talk about slowing down production from Russia or import from Russia, but it looks like Europe is importing as much as they have since the start of the war, and it's definitely not going down and is trending back up. Things were turned off for a while, trending up now from what I saw. So you've got all these energy policies that are having massive effects, and now a political debate with the Federal Reserve involved and powerful political institutions pressuring them to not include too much ESG calculations. We're already seeing that play out in oil and gas leases. If you remember on Friday, we mentioned a little bit about the slowdown in oil and gas leases from the government to the oil producers. And they're basically all around royalty sharing and what portion will be carved out for ESG considerations and greenhouse gas mitigation. So that's a really big policy hanging over an entire industry. Now, that brings us to our lesson for the day. If we look at the duel, Elon Musk challenging this duel, if we look at the energy policies coming out of both Europe, potentially America, and finally we look at supply chain policies coming out of all of these different jurisdictions that have caused stress on the globalized supply chain, we start to see a couple of avenues. We start to see some real battlefronts of World War III that have become really clear and really vivid over the last couple of days. And you can actually start to see the policy options that are available because of the conflict for Bitcoin to, let's say, slip up the middle. We want to mention that Tom Brady came out of retirement today, announced he was back. So a Bitcoiner, so we got to mention him. We tried to make this board originally out of X's and O's because what I'm about to talk about looks a little bit like in America we call a quarterback play action fake. A little bit like what Tom Brady played on his own career. I'm going to retire, and then he hides the ball and he comes back. And so the play action fake, for people who are not American, basically is when the quarterback takes the snap and pretends to hand it to a running back. And the running back makes it look like they're running up the field, and supposedly defenders will move to get that person. And even offensive players will pretend as if the running back, the guy running with the ball who's just been handed from the quarterback, has it. So they'll all mimic that the ball is going that way. Meanwhile, the quarterback will drop back and launch it to a receiver who knows that the ball is coming to him and is the only one who knows that it's still there. Tom Brady was a real master at this move, doing this and then throwing it. And I tried to do it here because what it ends up doing is it shows that there is this opening, there is this hole up the middle, there is this opportunity, and it comes in these two particular policy failures of nation states. In the same way that nation states are having to resort to the huge bludgeon of war to settle small disputes that could otherwise be solved by an Alexander Hamilton type duel or an Elon Musk versus Putin wrestling match or whatever it could be. It looks like the policy options used for these really vital industries are actually creating a situation where the market, if it has the right tools, can come up the middle and basically bring an era of hyper Bitcoinization. And I'll explain why. We find ourselves caught between sort of two extremes where socialism, and this is the old Chinese statement from the 1980s, that you can have capitalism with Chinese characteristics. But it's turning out that all of that capitalism was built on US dollars. So in the end, what you have is a fight between institutions fighting over US dollars. So it's not even capitalism anymore. It's socialism having absorbed the US dollar, pushing through policy choices, which will affect the US dollar, theoretically the psychological functioning of capitalism. But what if there's another capitalistic option that comes from the market that isn't infused as an opposite to Chinese policy, another politicized dollar? But what if energy, and we've seen this before, energy become politicized in Europe, now politicized in America? It looks like the Federal Reserve might be going in the footsteps of the European Union with some of their silly energy choices and not embracing those technologies that the market really is begging for, such as nuclear energy. So, and the other one being supply chains. So we've seen supply chains now break down globally, but a lot of those supply chains are actually the result of what we can call this, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, where we already are, the US dollar with Chinese characteristics. Because would these decisions be made to ship things if, for example, the trade imbalance between the United States and China weren't the way it was? If there wasn't the ability of the Chinese system to manipulate global dollar markets in order to manipulate the currency to have a trade imbalance to sell to America, to keep the American currency high, the Chinese currency low, and to be able to create that consumer-supplier relationship over all these years? Well, Bitcoiners, of course, if the money is removed from the situation, would say probably not. And Bitcoiners, it looks like, are already sourcing supply chains which seem a lot more sustainable, particularly from diets. There's a lot of local diet stuff. Bitcoiners, of course, are not looking to buy the latest Chinese consumer good. That doesn't seem to be really in the cards. You can even see in news today in China with that slowdown, that Foxconn, the major supplier of iPhones, is announcing potentially moving a major operation to Saudi Arabia or UAE in order to get out of that issue, in order to get out of any one policy, basically keeping them from having the options to be able to export and not being under the thumb of one particular political entity's policy choices. So supply chains themselves have for a long time been considered a avenue for Bitcoin to enter the equation. Let's not forget that Michael Saylor himself, when he's not buying Bitcoin, does anyone know what Michael Saylor's business actually does? Do people know what MicroStrategy does? Well, MicroStrategy is a supply chain optimization platform, basically. This is Michael Saylor just last December saying, when we are not buying Bitcoin to fight inflation, we are doing our best to make supply chains more efficient. 28 billion pound retailer Sainsbury's initiated MicroStrategy to 12,000 employees, stores, depots, and offices, standardize the use of MicroStrategy's technologies in order to make supply chains more efficient and function. We get Ryan Peterson, who's the CEO of Flexport. And I'd say that since we've seen all of these supply chain issues in America, when it came to the initial COVID lockdown, then it came to the issues over in Los Angeles, Ryan became probably the global expert in supply chain management with his little company. He was the only CEO that was taking helicopter tours of the Port of Los Angeles, where the helicopter guy said, "We've never had a CEO do this." Of course, he also just put Bitcoin on his balance sheet. So I'm mentioning two supply chain optimization platforms now that have Bitcoin already on their balance sheet, already optimized for Bitcoin to be a global reserve currency when it comes to shipping magnates who understand all these different risks of inflation when it comes to 90-day delivery times and all the complexities of supply chain and financing over short periods of time, which can always cause trouble, particularly in inflationary periods like now. So if we take this two combination, we take the market where socialism and capitalism still intersect. These two things have not fully broken apart. There is still an overlap. It's still about personal choices. And in the end, because these two places meet and the market is still a place to get movement on supply chains and energy, there remains an opportunity for the fight between, the two, let's say, poles of capitalism and socialism, freedom and privacy versus forced choices. So freedom of choice, forced choices, and surveillance, of privacy and surveillance. So the way for us to get through this and not get confused by an America that is becoming more and more, from a policy point of view, unrecognizable from Europe and other places that don't seem to have really the capacity to get going here and to win it. I mean, look at how far behind Europe is today. I guess they voted on the MICA thing with proof of work today. But I mean, really, you're in a position where your whole energy policy has been set by Greta, and that was probably a mistake. And it looks more and more like it was mostly a Russian disinformation campaign in the first place that brought Greta to national, global prominence. It probably was the funding of numerous think tanks, numerous NGOs, seeded them all with the idea that we need all the solar panels and windmills in the world, and actually don't look at nuclear, it's super dangerous, and we'll see where you're at in 5 years. Oh, guess what? You still have to buy the oil that funded these studies. Well, that's where they're at, right? And so America now, I don't think America would fall down as far as Europe has on this, because this is already, a month after wars being fought over really poor policy decisions, and they still had a pretty tight vote. They had a pretty tight vote on some obscure issue of proof of work versus proof of stake in what really shouldn't be a relevant body to the EU, which is the normalization of investment banking across the continent. Investment banking in outside of England, and which is no longer in the EU, and Ireland, which is basically the entire investment banking scene in Europe. Switzerland, not a part of the EU, right? So not involved in this stuff. when you look at Ireland, Ireland is really just a corporate tax situation for American companies. They do put up a lot of investment banks there. They do put up a lot of investment houses there, which are more or less the US hedge funds. You can think of them as a US hedge fund or a US broker dealer. They don't really have broker dealers in Europe. It is these investment firms that operate. So some law, like an SEC type of thing, that is looking at just the use of financial assets. And not only that, it's already a really complicated thing that barely anyone's following in Europe because it's too complicated, and England didn't get on board. So what the heck's the point? So it's an already convoluted, complicated institution that barely anyone pays attention to in Europe. And this is its little brother, basically created to satisfy some applications from a few exchanges that they didn't quite know how to deal with. And even that was tough to pass. So there's certainly an issue with wake-up calls over there. So what you get now is a situation where two particular industries, supply chains and energy, are ready for a market-driven response that isn't the same as a Chinese policy choice and an American policy choice or a European policy choice. And if these two market forces can be compelled, we might get actually globally sustainable, there it goes, actually globally sustainable supply chains. And what we always talk about in this show, nuclear powered Bitcoin mining. Nuclear powered Bitcoin mining with Bitcoin financed small modular nuclear reactors would probably end any confusion about Bitcoin being an absolute global reserve currency today, because it would actually be backed by power that it is not under the whims of, it is not affected by in terms of policy decisions, and could really become one of the most important pieces of the collateralization of Bitcoin and hyper-Bitcoinization. So that's the show today. It looks like World War III, the economic side, forget the kinetic war, World War III economic side, really energy, really supply chains. And if you combine those two, global reserve currency is within reach. Could be 2 weeks to become hyper-Bitcoinized, depending on whatever this fella said about China. I think it might take a little bit longer, but maybe not. If Elon Musk can win that duel and we get Ukraine back in the next couple of days, and then we fire up a nuclear reactor there, it's over. We win. Game over. I call it. I call World War III done.